Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Ted, your host, and we are continuing right along with our discussion, our lecture series on the mid-19th century civil rights movement. And where we last left off, we were discussing the integration of the United States military. We last left off discussing President Truman's executive order in which he flushed his commander-in-chief muscles and ordered the integration of all American forces. And the first war to be fought with integrated units was the Korean War. And there was a lot of success. The order was actually sped up because of the involvement in the Korean War. And a lot of progress had been made, most notably within the Naval Marine Corps. By the end of the Korean War, the Army the military as a whole was approaching full unit integration. Military leaders quickly learned that in the heat of battle, skin color really made no difference. By the end of the Vietnam War, jumping ahead, all of the enlisted service members were fully integrated, though integration in the officer corps took longer. Now, the Vietnam War itself offered a very different civil rights issue, as African Americans made up 11% of the total armed forces, but accounted for 20% of all casualties. Now, pacifist civil rights leaders began to question American involvement in Vietnam and the divergence of national resources into persecuting a war against an impoverished Southeastern Asian population instead of investing in domestic anti-poverty programs. But we shall get to all of that later. Now, opposition to the Vietnam War was not limited to the African American leaders in the civil rights movement. The anti-war movement morphed from a grassroots organization, a grassroots beginning into a significant force in the United States, and played a vital, if not pivotal, role in shortening the war and bringing about an end to conscript forces and ushering in the age of the all-volunteer force that we have now. Now, social factors at play at home, such as continued discrimination, high unemployment rates in the rural and urban locations, led African Americans to seek military service. By the 1980s, fully one-third of the United States Army was African American, while African Americans made up approximately 10 and 15% of the armed forces of the Air Force and the Navy, the other branches of the armed forces. By the end of the 20th century, African Americans made up about 1/5 of all of the armed forces, and the officer corps saw great progress, as well as seeing Colin Powell become the first and the most highest ranked officer in the armed forces. He was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, a great achievement. Now we discussed the Gaines case and the Sweat case and the Mclaren case before, but in this lecture, I'd simply like to touch bases on the cases again to sort of set the social stage for the civil rights movement in the mid 20th century. And so, going back to the Gaines case, in 1938, the case of Missouri ex Rel Gaines was brought about after Lloyd Gaines was denied admission to the Missouri Law School on the grounds of his ethnicity. Now, he filed suit and took his case to the Supreme Court, where Thurgood Marshall, his attorney, argued that the doctrine of separate but equal had effectively denied him an equal opportunity to become a lawyer in Missouri. The Supreme Court did not strike down or overturn the ruling of the Plessy case, but noted that since Missouri did not have an all African American law school for Gaines to attend, Gaines would either have to attend the state law school, or the state would have to build an equal law school for African Americans to attend. And the 1950 case of Sweat v. Painter followed on the heels of the Gaines case. The state was faced with the decision of either admitting African Americans to higher degree program, graduate courses, or building African American separate schools to attend. Now, Hyman Sweat applied to the University of Texas Law School and argued that although the state of Texas had a separate African American law school, it was far below. It was far below in caliber. It was genuinely inferior to the all European American law school. And the Supreme Court again refused to strike down the Plessy ruling, though it did note that since that since the African American school was not equal, Sweat must be allowed to attend the University of Texas Law School. Also in 1950, there was the Henderson case. The case of Hennessy v. United States, which centered on Elmer Henderson, an African American man who had been separated from other diners on a locomotive dining car. The Supreme Court ruled that railroads had to end Jim Crow segregation on the locomotive cars. And again, this did not strike down Plessy v. Ferguson. It was simply they did not have a reciprocal dining car that was equal to the one that Henderson had been excluded from, so they would have to admit them. They would have to admit him there. And of course, the Mclaren case of the case of Mclaren versus Oklahoma Board of Regents. George Mclaren, the African American student who had been admitted to the University of Oklahoma, but had not been allowed to sit in any of the classrooms or the cafeteria or use the or the facilities. He was forced to listen to lectures in the hallway. Thurgood Marshall led the charge on this one and brought the case before the United States Supreme Court, where the justices ruled that the graduate students could not be segregated in any of the school's facilities. Now, the integration of the military was a smashing success compared to the integration of the Republic schools, which were laboriously sort of hawked over by the proponents of segregation. And really, the integration of schools remains a very highly controversial issue even into the early seasons of the 21st century, I should say. There are a number of reasons why the two institutions had very different results in integration, and the two institutions would be schools, education, and the armed forces, the military. The military, let me just say, is a highly centralized institution that is reinforced by abject loyalty and obedience to one's superiors. It is a central concept to all armed forces that orders must be obeyed. Schools, on the other hand, had always been seen as a domestic institution under the purview of the local community and the states at large. Interference by the federal government in the name of civil rights often conjured up resentment. It often became a rallying cry to the tyranny of some centralized authority. It often became this lightning bolt, this thunder rod for public resentment, and it still is. It still is in many cases. Now, military bases are often situated in locations where a more multicultural, cosmopolitan environment prevails, whereas local prejudices are far less likely to survive and pollute the atmosphere. Schools, in contrast, are situated in neighborhoods where local groupthink is more likely to influence attitudes. Also, the armed forces. The armed forces is an adult environment, whereas schools are an environment for children. Moreover, integration became a values argument. For many who sought to reinforce Redeemer ideas, the raising of children, the raising of their children in a way that they wanted to see raised, or the imparting of ideals and values that they wanted, became a central rallying focal point. They believed that their society, that their culture, this racial caste system would wither on the vine and die if they did not reinforce it at the base level, if they did not reinforce it with children at the base level. All right, and so with that said, I'd like to just dash back a few lectures ago to Reconstruction, and just speak on Reconstruction for a minute. Reconstruction brought about the rigid separation of schools, a separation that became entrenched and protected by law with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which allowed for separate but equal educational facilities. Jim Crow segregation in public facilities was more about the separation of peoples rather than equality, I'd like to say. During the 1920s, the state of Alabama, for example, had a student spending ratio of $36 for every European American student and $10 for every African American student. The Supreme Court began to chip away at the Plessy decision little by little, ruling that the states of Missouri and Maryland had to open up their law schools to African American students. The state of Oklahoma also saw an African American enter her school of education, the graduate program. Now, even with those accomplishments, segregation remained firmly entrenched within the Republic's schools. The NAACP set out in 1948 to challenge segregation. Thurgood Marshall, then the head of the NAACP legal staff, oversaw this initiative. There were a number of cases to choose from in the 1950s. However, sensing the threat to the future lawsuits, several Dixiecrat governments set out and publicly declared that they were going to improve the state of African American educational facilities. And this was a move done after having learned the hard lesson of the Mclaren case, the Sipawell case, and the Gaines case, that if they did not create separate institutions, then their institutions would be integrated. That if they did not bring those separate institutions up to par with the institutions that they had for European American students, that their institutions will be integrated. They set on this grand campaign. It was too late, however. It was really too late for them. The NAACP, seeing through this new strategy, sought a case in which spending levels were roughly equal in order to directly challenge the separate but equal doctrine, the ruling from the Plessy case. The case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1952, which would prove to be the most important challenge to segregation in the history of the United States, was then launched. Marshall and a team of lawyers argued that separation was inherently unequal even if the facilities were equal. The case was won on the argument that the very inequality was in violation, that segregation bred this sort of inherent inequality, even if the facilities were equal, and that very inequality was in and of itself a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. They also argued that the separation of students created an identity of second-class citizens for African American students. And with that said, I'd like to break here and come up with part 3 of our discussion, our lectures on the civil rights, the mid-19th century civil rights movement. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.